Turning now to today's perspective. You have no doubt heard of the Me Too movement, but what about Let Her Speak? It's a campaign to give a voice to survivors of sexual abuse, to allow them break the silence so often imposed by the perpetrator and often by society. Let Her Speak was launched by Australian women who realised that as young survivors they were legally forbidden from speaking out publicly and telling their truth about the rape and other abuse they went through, while the criminals could speak. The victims were being silenced by the law. One of those women, Australia's Woman of the Year in fact, decided to take on the battle and get the legal system to listen. After much financial and emotional cost, she did manage to get the law overturned. After being raped by her maths teacher when she was only 15, our guest today has become a strong advocate for human rights and is even now helping the US police understand how child grooming works. She joins us now to tell us more. Grace Tame, thank you so much for your time and indeed all you have done. Can I start maybe with that issue of child grooming? Not only did you survive abuse, but you seem to have gone away and analysed how it actually happened.
Yeah, that's right. And thank you, Eve, for that very generous welcome. In January this year, I was named Australian of the Year for my advocacy, working for survivors of child sexual abuse, myself also being a survivor of child sexual abuse. And part of my healing was through actually studying, I guess, looking up and reading about what grooming is. And when I first looked up the term grooming, I could relate to every single aspect of it. And although it's a really complex thing, it can be simplified into 6 main phases, all of which I can speak to. The first phase of grooming is targeting. That is identifying a vulnerable victim. So in my case, not only was I an innocent child, and all children, of course, are by nature vulnerable, I was also battling severe anorexia. I'd just been hospitalised, in fact, a second time and had nearly died. The second phase of grooming is gaining trust. So that is establishing a friendship to lull the target into a false sense of security, to make them think that they've got someone that they can confide in and trust. The third phase is filling a need, which is particularly calculated because that involves identifying a specific gap in the target's emotional support, and then as the predator, playing the role that fills that gap. So in my case, I come from a very loving family, and I also had a team of very attentive medical professionals around me at the time, but a lot of their support was in the form of tough love. So this pedophile saw that, and what he did was play the role of sympathizer and telling me everything that he thought I wanted to hear. The fourth phase of grooming is isolating, which is happening at the same time as all these other phases, and that involves driving even further wedges between the target and their genuine emotional support network. The fifth phase is particularly insidious. It is the sexualizing, which is the gradual exposure to sexual content so as to normalize it. So in my case, this pedophile made me watch a lot of films that glorified relationships between characters with significant age differences. There was one particular film, the last line of which is, "Give me a girl at an impressionable age and she is mine for life." Another film was The Graduate, which is a well-known classic that features a significant age difference between the two characters. And the sixth phase, which is what the success of the abuse really hinges on. The sixth phase is maintaining control, which means striking a perfect balance between causing pain, but also being the provider of relief from that pain, which is what predators are so successful at doing.
That sounds so incredibly confusing if you're faced with those two emotions from the one person. I mean, so much psychological as well as the physical abuse. How did you come to finding the courage and the wherewithal to speak out?
Well, I don't think it was really ever a conscious choice for me, actually, and it certainly wasn't about courage as far as as far as I understand it, I was always driven by a want to help and protect and educate others. While I was being abused by this pedophile, he let on that he had abused other girls before me, and I've since found out that not only were there other victims, but the school where I was abused by this teacher actually knew about his history, and he was there from 1992 until 2011, which is when I reported him to police in 2011. So really it was just, the motivation for me was just that it was a fundamental wrong, and there were so many layers of injustice that needed to be corrected.
And what you're saying there is the school were aware. So again, there was a lot of people ignoring the problem. When you did speak out, you were listened to. Do you think that that's the exception to the rule still in society in Australia today?
I do think it's the exception to the rule in society the world over. Unfortunately, because of entrenched victim-blaming attitudes and because of a general ignorance of the psychological manipulation that really underpins these crimes. What has to be understood is that there were staff members who had tried to stand up to this pedophile, for example, but as soon as he fought back, they submitted, because he was a bully and he coerced them as well. And that's really important to understand, is that predators don't just groom their targets, they groom all of us. They groom friends, family, colleagues, and thereby the whole of society. So we stay trapped in this lack of understanding.
And this mental mindset, because maybe one of the examples of that is after your abuser admitted guilt and was convicted, it was nonetheless described as a relationship that he was guilty of rather than actual rape.
Yeah, so he was, not only was he convicted of the crime against me, he was found with 28 multimedia files of child abuse material on his computer, including a trophy file of other girls, other students that were topless. But the wording of the main offence was maintaining a sexual relationship with a person under the age of 17. And that was the wording only in Tasmania, the state of Australia where I'm from. In other states, that same exact offence was called the persistent sexual abuse of a child. Now, those two sound very, very different. One of them is very convoluted, and it also softens multiple aspects of the crime by calling it a relationship, which has connotations of consent, but also by calling a child a person under the age of 17. So that was actually one of the things that, through the Let Her Speak campaign, we campaigned to change, and we were successful in changing the name of that offence to the persistent sexual abuse of a child.
Okay, so successful in changing that to be more directly related to what it is, but you also had a very big success, it would sound like, in breaking the silence that was being imposed on the survivors of sexual abuse.
Yes, that's correct. So in 2017, after even more injustices, because this pedophile was also, after he was released from prison, he was awarded a federally funded PhD scholarship to study at the only university in my home state. And while he was studying there, he went online and actually boasted about his experience of abusing me. He described it as awesome and enviable to get to do the things that he did to a child. And for making those public comments, he was actually convicted a second time for producing child exploitation material in descriptive form. But the university did nothing, and he was allowed to continue his studies. And in fact, he was eventually awarded his doctorate. So I connected with groundbreaking freelance journalist Nina Fennell in the hopes of shedding light on all of these injustices and the corrupt cultures that underpin and drive them. And then after we rehashed all of the traumatic details, we discovered that we were barred by this law that silenced survivors of child sexual abuse even after they turned 18 and gave their consent to share their stories in public interest. So then that's why we started the campaign.
One wonders how they justified silencing people who had often been silenced by perpetrators in their abuse. But I believe you now, as we were saying, it's a global issue. I believe you're now helping the US police even try and understand the process.
Yes, I did have some conversations a couple of years ago with the Human Trafficking Task Force that's based out of the LA County Sheriff's Department. But those were just conversations. Now my work is based here. I'm currently campaigning for more law reform on a national scale in Australia. For instance, we have 8 different states. Therefore, we have 8 different jurisdictions that govern the issue of sexual abuse. And as such, we have 8 different definitions of consent, 8 different definitions of the age of a child, the age of consent to sex, different definitions of sexual intercourse, and also different definitions of grooming. And in fact, in some jurisdictions, grooming isn't even defined at all. So even though it's a huge undertaking to get harmony between different jurisdictions who are often very possessive of their legislation, that is something that I'm campaigning for here.
Grace Tame, Australian Person of the Year and woman who is changing laws and making noise for survivors of abuse. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
You're watching live from Paris. If you're just joining us, these are our top stories this hour. A massive expulsion campaign underway in the United States. They've started flying hundreds of Haitians out of Texas without allowing them the chance to apply for asylum. Snap elections in Canada see Liberal Prime Minister Justin Trudeau struggling to stay in power as Conservative Erin O'Toole said to be matching him in the polls as the election begins. And erupting for the first time in half a century, a volcano on the Canary island of La Palma has started to spew molten lava and forced locals to flee.